So about a year ago, Rob Scallon and Dave from Boy in a Band challenged themselves to create the, quote, most brutal breakdown ever. Watching them slow the breakdown to absurdly slow speeds got me thinking, what is the slowest music possible? Let's find out. Peace. Slowness is often associated with austerity, solemnity, and contemplation. We slow music down to signify weight and importance. Traditional markings for slow tempos include Adagio, Lento, and Largo, but one of the slowest is grave, meaning serious and significant, as in the English grave danger.
You are in grave danger.
Grave in English also can refer to burial plot. Slow music can take on a funereal meaning, like in the music that you're listening to right now. The third movement of Chopin's Piano Sonata No. 2, otherwise known as his Funeral March. Funeral doom metal might not be as introspective, but it is a subgenre of metal that relies upon extremely slow riffs. My question is this music too slow to headbang to? Is there any limitation on how slow and how brutal a riff can be before we just can't headbang to it anymore? Is there any limitation to the graveness of it?
Slow down! I want to get there, but I want to get there alive!
It turns out that there is a limit. I mean, not a limit to how slow you can move your head, but how slow you can actually connect to beats in your mind. When you headbang, or when you dance, or tap your foot, or just feel a groove, you're experiencing something that researchers call subjective rhythmization. Your brain is organizing sounds into strong and weak beats. It's something that we just naturally do whenever we hear a stream of steady pulses, but only within a certain speed. In The Psychology of Time, Paul Freis notes that above 1800 milliseconds, subjective rhythmization becomes impossible, and successive sounds are not perceptually linked. 1800 milliseconds is roughly 33 beats per minute, which we can set as a slowest possible musical tempo. You're now hearing a drum beat at 25 beats per minute, and although you could probably intellectually surmise that it's a steady pulse, it kind of doesn't really feel like one. Consider this field of letters. As aesthetic as the wide font is, it's impossible to give any meaning to the individual letters. That is, until we shorten the distance between the letters to actually create a perceptual link between them. Such as it also is with drum grooves. The slowest possible tempo of 33 beats per minute is often linked to something called the perceptual present, the window into our brain's stream of conscious that links together moments and experiences to feel like now. Perceptual present is what philosopher William James called the short duration of which we are immediately and incessantly sensible. It's also been called a saddleback on which we sit perched and from which we look into two directions into time. There are different estimates for how long the perceptual present is, but auditory researcher Diana Deutsch pegs it somewhere between 3 to 8 seconds. In order for us to feel music and experience subjective rhythmization, multiple beats need to occur within the perceptual present. If music is too slow, rhythm becomes the literal memory of a pulse, rather than something that you're experiencing in the now. We don't want to remember the groove as we're listening to it. We don't want to think back on that last China hit as we're headbanging. We want to feel it. And the human brain is hardwired in a way that we just can't escape. Well, sort of. There are some practical ways around this. For example, what you can do is you can set a metronome to, say, 80 beats per minute, and then try and internalize this pulse, so that when you slow it down to, say, 20 beats per minute, a quarter the speed, you'll still be feeling this 80 beats per minute pulse as a subdivision of 20 beats per minute, which technically is outside the range of the perceptual present. Check it out. This is what's happening in a tune like Donny Hathaway's I'll Love You More Than You'll Ever Know. There are wide spaces between dotted quarter note beats, which clock in roughly at 33 or so beats per minute. The musicians are feeling a 6/8 subdivision, but the music doesn't explicitly give the faster eighth note pulses right away. You'll have to infer the pulses from what you're hearing.
You have to listen to the notes she's not playing.
Saxophonist Steve Lehman wrote his doctoral thesis on something called liminality, the rhythmic thresholds that exist between the past and the present. This is why I find I'll Love You More Than You'll Ever Know, as well as the Funeral Doom song, so compelling, because they both exist at the rhythmic threshold of 33 beats per minute, the slowest possible tempo. They both display liminality, the gray regions of musical perception. I sense that somewhere in our perception there exists a limit, a 0 degree, beneath which it is impossible to pass without sinking into absurdity. Put it another way, if we go too slow, say 30 beats per minute, the music will be what Justin London calls, quote, too slow to be useful. Well, doesn't that sound like a challenge? There are definitely pieces of music out there that have a slower pulse than the intended lower limit of 33 beats per minute, even if we can't feel it. George Crumb's piece for piano, Spiral Galaxy from Makrokosmos, has the tempo marking of, quote, vast, lonely, and timeless, where eighth note equals 20 beats per minute, or once every 3 seconds. A 3-second long eighth note is certainly slow, but I'm sure we can get vaster and lonelier and timelessier. Because once we're freed from the shackles of the perceptual present, we can now think about temporal music, music organized by stretches of time, not rhythms that we feel. Ambient music and drone music fall into this temporal music category, where music is not conceived with subjective rhythmization in mind. In 1960, composer Lamont Young scrolled out a series of conceptual pieces on a couple of napkins. Composition 1960 No. 7 has been the most popular of these. It consists solely of the notes B and F sharp, quote,
to be held for a long time.
Performances of this piece can last up to 45 minutes, and is widely considered the start of modern drone music. Young would write of this fledgling new style that he was developing. One of the aspects of form that I've been very interested in is stasis, form which allows time to stand still. We can agree that this takes a long time, but is it really slow? I mean, it might feel slow, but there's really nothing that actually happens. I kind of want to find music that has the most time between events. Composition 60 No. 7 kind of fails at that because there's only one event, the B and F sharp. For me, the slowest piece of music would have to represent time on a grand scale and to not be timeless with stasis. I want to find music that is truly epically slow. I want to find music that's, well, come to think of it, kind of similar to the Rob Scallon Boy in the Band video where they create the most brutal breakdown ever. The original video ends with a breakdown that has a tempo of
1 BPW.
1 beats per week?
For the next month, Rob uploaded a series of videos once per day into a playlist that quite literally takes a full month to complete one measure of 4/4. In this bit of high-effort posting, they may have inadvertently performed the slowest piece of music ever seen to completion. Of course, there were plenty of people who witnessed this who thought that they would be cute and would come up with even slower tempos for the breakdown.
What about 1 BPC, beats per century? BPM equals beats per millennia. How about 1 beats per quadrillion years? 1 beat per age of the universe?
Yeah, this is fine. But it's one thing to have an idea, and then another thing entirely to actually try and see it through to its completion. Anybody can have an idea, but do you have the technique, the time, and the energy to actually do it? I want to find an act of slow music that people have actually dared to achieve, not the idle musings of YouTube comment sections.
What about 1 beat per heat death of the universe? But since time is cyclical, there are actually multiple universe heat deaths, and what if it's an odd time signature heat death over the bar line groove? Oh my god, I just invented heat death gent. I'm amazing, that's so brutal.
What is the slowest thing that we have ever committed to? And how long until it's done?
Let's slow it way down.
Turns out it's a lot longer than a month. Even the most brutal breakdown ever pales in comparison to the slowest piece of music that mankind is ever likely to perform. It is a work that will span generations and has already taken several decades to perform the first several notes. I'm talking about John Cage's Organ 2 ASLSP, otherwise known as Slow as Possible. Yeah, I'm not really quite sure how that acronym is supposed to work, but That's what it is, so take my word for it. When John Cage wrote the piece, he didn't actually specify how slow he wanted it. Its original performance lasted 29 minutes, but subsequent performances have been a lot slower. A recent, fairly sprightly 15-hour performance by Diane Luches made one reviewer remark, "Almost each change in notes or tone colors seemed positively cataclysmic in this glacial context." In the late 90s, a group of scholars got together in Germany to figure out exactly how slow they could make this piece. Any answer would be fairly arbitrary, but they did come up with an answer nonetheless. The performance would last 639 years. The first 12-tone keyboard had been installed in the organ at the Halberstadt Cathedral 639 years earlier, and so that seemed as good an answer as any other. And so, since September 5th, 2001, there has been a concert occurring of John Cage's As Slow as Possible in a small church in Halberstadt, Germany, that will last until the year 2640. Every couple of years, a note changes on the organ, and every time a note changes, it makes international headlines. When this happens, there's sometimes a bit of a pilgrimage, as hundreds of people look on as the notes change on a specifically constructed organ meant to play continuously for the next half a millennium. Somewhat continuously, anyway, as it so happens there are rests in the music, and right now we are actually in a rest, which has been occurring since 2013. The next note is scheduled to be performed in the year 2020, so be sure to mark your calendars. Hans Ola Eriksson told the BBC in 2003 that the performance is, quote, "a sound that we give to the future to take care of." The Halberstadt performance of As Slow as Possible is so slow that it will last beyond the lifetime of any human being ever to exist. It's a multi-generational performance. No human being will see both its beginning and its end. Its performance is like the construction of a medieval cathedral, like the Halberstadt Cathedral. Those who witness its beginning will never know its end, and those who witness its end will only know it as something that has always been going on. Even the pyramids were built in a single human lifetime. This work it's bigger, it's slower, it's the slowest piece of music. And that's great and all, but what does it even mean? Like, why do hundreds of people travel every couple of years to a small town in eastern Germany just to hear a note change? Why bother? Local organizers feel that, quote, "it doesn't mean anything, it's just there." So, basically a high-effort post, not that much different than the, quote, "most brutal breakdown ever." Just something that people put a lot of time into to see if they could do it. The sentiment that the John Cage performance is, quote, "just there," does bring to mind what mountaineer George Mallory said when he was asked why even bother climbing Mount Everest. Because it's there. Because it will take many generations to complete. I mean, theoretically anyway, that is in case, AI doesn't take over everything in the next 100 years, which is the more likely scenario. Because we're actually performing this piece and we're actually doing it, we have to look way out into the future and realize how gigantic the undertaking is. This is what Immanuel Kant calls the sublime. Because it's so slow, it makes us reckon with the infinite vastness of time. We have to face it in order to actually perform this piece of music. It makes us confront our mortality in one way, but it also makes us confront the idea that, well, maybe our civilization's not going to be here in 600 years to hear this piece of music. Scary thoughts indeed, and all coming from the actual undertaking of trying to perform this piece of music for so damn long. So yeah, As Slow as Possible is definitely the slowest piece of music, but there's something that doesn't feel super musical about the whole thing. I mean, it feels more like a performance art piece or something vaguely architectural, maybe. So you can take your pick as far as what you feel the slowest piece of music should be. Is it John Cage's conceptual postmodern 6th century thing? Or is it pieces of music that last at the threshold of the perceptual present at around 33 beats per minute? It really just kind of depends on what you're going for. Are you going for that grand gesture, or are you going for that liminal feeling that comes from listening to music at rhythmic thresholds? Both carry with them that feeling of weight and importance, and sometimes slowing music down is required to express feelings of great levity, because music is used to express emotion that language sometimes just can't. Leonard Bernstein gave a lecture series called The Unanswered Question, and in this lecture series he talks about Mahler's 9th Symphony, his final symphony. Now, the music on the last page of the last movement of the last symphony of Gustav Mahler just so happens to be
really slow.
The slow